Thank you all for continuing the conversation. It's almost hard to believe there's anything left to say after those panels. So I was going to propose that we do this whole thing in rap, you know, or maybe in Finnish. But I thought that was a little unfair, given that I haven't given the panel advance warning of that. Also,
That's right.
You wouldn't want to hear me. I'm joined here by Olivier Blanchard, who's now at the Peterson Institute, formerly of the International Monetary Fund and MIT, Loretta Mester, who is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, Ben Bernanke, of course, the former Fed chairman and our colleague here at Brookings, and Paul Krugman, the economist at City University of New York now, right? Yep. And columnist for the New York Times. Krugman is the guy who makes all journalists nervous because he seems to be more productive than the rest of us, and that's kind of frightening given that he does all these other things on the side, but we can discuss that later. So I wanted to start by asking each of the panelists a little bit about what they took away from the conversation we had this morning. I want to start with Olivier, who makes the observation in this slide that you see behind us about that's been made about how the wage Phillips curve behaves perhaps as one might have expected, but prices aren't rising, and so the question is, what the hell is going on?
Okay, so I had prepared a slide in anticipation, and I think it has survived the previous 3 hours fairly well and coincides with a general message, and I think tells us where we need to look and what implications it has. So the diagram on the, which side is it? This one. Is familiar, except it's not in familiar form, but it basically has the inverse of the unemployment rate and the rate of inflation, of wage inflation measured by the employment cost index. And I think, you know, the relation is there. You could plot it in a scatter diagram, but it's there. And I think that's consistent with everything we've heard. Now, what people have put on the right-hand side typically is the Phillips curve, the price Phillips curve. What I've done instead of is plot the, again, the wage inflation using the employment cost index, which is the blue line, and the GDP price deflator, which for the purposes of thinking about markups is clearly a much better variable than the CPI. And this is what we produce. And basically there, you know, it's visually striking, which is that although we saw from the previous graph that the wage inflation was kind of okay, wage Phillips curve was okay, there doesn't seem to be much of a relation between the GDP price deflator and the ECI, employment cost index. It's really where there is clearly a disconnect. People have talked about the low pass-through. It's true, but there's much more than that. There's a lot of variation that in the price index, which is not coming from the cost index. So there will be these two dimensions. So starting there, my reactions to today. So I think the first puzzle is the slope of a relation between wage inflation and unemployment. And on this, I think we're now clear as to whether the slope has really declined or not. My sense from my own regressions is that it has, but somebody argued that if you do it right, it really has remained more or less the same. I think it has decreased. The simultaneity explanation, I think, is a very plausible candidate, subject to kind of a test that I suggested, but it seems to work. The other is that maybe there has been a change in the bargaining structure on wages. I mean, take the case, basically we think of bargaining as splitting the rents from a match. Well, if the workers are already at the bottom end, there's nothing which can be done to decrease their wage. So if everybody was paid the minimum wage, then we would find no effect of unemployment on wages. So I think there's something like this happening, but I don't think we've solved that one, and we need to do it. On the markup and the second graph, what is it? What's going on? I suspect measurement is a big part of it, and the more you know about the GDP deflator, the more you worry. But we've heard various explanations about pricing. I think some of them say, well, you know, some sectors really have to take the international price as given, and therefore you would not see the kind of pass-through. But that's not true for all sectors. So I think here we need to go sectoral in the same way as was done for labor and try to understand it. So that again, I think that's still work to be done. On the policy implications, which is the theme of the panel, this actually, I mean, the stability of the wage Phillips curve and the instability of the price Phillips curve has a fairly big implication, which I think hasn't been examined and should probably have been in the context of thinking about what the Fed should do, which is to have a wage inflation target rather than a price inflation target. I mean, it clearly is much more related to labor market developments. So from just an empirical point of view, it seems like a better measure to actually look at. But from a normative point of view, if you take a new Keynesian model and the markups reflect largely distortions, then actually it's a good idea to take a measure which doesn't have a markup in it, namely the wages, and basically focus on this. So if when you see wage inflation at 3% and you see productivity growth at 1%, then you're home, even if GDP deflator in my case, but the CPI or the core CPI moves around. So we had talked at a dinner with Janet, and we said we would write a paper together. Janet has been a bit busy. But I think that's still worth exploring. Also politically, actually, telling people that the Fed cares about wages and has wage inflation as a target is probably a plus in addition.
So does that mean you'd be tightening now because wages are rising?
I would basically think that we're more or less at full employment, right? And wage inflation is about 3-something. In productivity is around 1. That's consistent with a price level correctly measured of about 2. Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm more on the hawkish side these days than,
Oh my goodness.
than Jared. That's easy. I'll stop.
Loretta Mester, so I've noticed that in a number of your presentations over the recent months, you have a lot of things. If it's the case that non-monetary structural factors are holding back measured inflation, then that's a very different implication for policy than if it's an aggregate demand shortfall. So I'm just sort of curious what sense you make of all this evidence that we've heard this morning on what's driving inflation and the work that you've done and your people have done at the Cleveland Fed. What explanations do you buy for what we've seen?
Yeah, so I grew up in Baltimore, so H.L. Mencken is from Baltimore. So he had this line basically that said, for every problem, right, there's a simple, elegant solution that's wrong. So I don't think there's a simple one-word answer to this. So yes, our Inflation Research Center is doing a lot of work in trying to understand inflation dynamics. So we have results that basically say, if you look at the structural part of inflation that is related to the labor market and the acyclical part, the cyclical part and the acyclical part or structural part.
So I mean the cyclical part is prices that usually move when the economy
labor
booms and
market
busts,
tightness,
and the
right.
acyclical part are things like maybe healthcare
idiosyncratic
price.
shocks, healthcare, which is the big part of it. Other parts that aren't really related. That the cyclical part is only 40%, right, of inflation now. So part of what's going on, I think, is that you have idiosyncratic factors that affect the labor market, but affect the inflation rates, and it's not just the labor market and tightness in the labor market, but if you do just look at the cyclical part, it certainly is correlated with tightness in the labor market. So I believe there is still this relationship and that we can use it to help predict inflation. That said, you have to recognize that there are these acyclical factors affecting measured inflation. And so I think you want to be careful about sort of trying to explain everything with what's going on in the labor market. So that means that, if you see a shock, it may take longer to get back to your inflation target than it would otherwise. From a policy and explaining and a communications point of view, you may want to be thinking about a range as opposed to a point target, because you have these shocks that are going to move inflation off of your target, even if your trend inflation rate is moving up. And so there are implications for how you think about how you communicate your target. And I think the results we saw today on inflation expectations were very provocative in the sense that it makes you think about a different way of communicating and perhaps a different way of thinking about the interplay between inflation expectations and your target. So from my point of view, you might have shocks that move inflation off your trend, but the trend underlying inflation rate is going to be driven by inflation expectations. And so I agree with the remark that Janet made in the beginning that, the stability of inflation expectations is key to allowing you to be able to run your monetary policy. I think the results that talked about the Amazon effect and the fact that pricing models are changing are very interesting, because if it's true that prices are becoming more flexible, right? If you think about in a DSGE model, right, why is monetary policy able to cushion against, right, these shocks on the real side? It's because of sticky prices. If prices become less sticky because there's more frequent price changes, that means monetary policy is less effective, or said differently, you have to move your policy rate more to have the similar effect. So again, right, these changes, these underlying structural changes, I think are more important than just how do you measure inflation. They may actually change the transmission mechanism of monetary policy.
Ben, are you convinced that something's changed in the structural side of unemployment, or is it just that for some accident of history we've had wise monetary policy makers, as Silvana points out, and that everything's all the same, the only thing that's changed is the quality of monetary policy? I want an objective.
Everybody's laughing, but that's actually my opinion. I think the most important factor over the long haul has been changing, not wiser monetary policy, but a monetary policy focused on anchoring inflation expectations.
That's probably
If Mark Watson and Jim Stock had a really nice paper where they studied the dynamics of inflation using the so-called unobserved components model, and the basic message was that 30 or 40 years ago, if there was a shock to inflation, a significant part of that shock was permanent. It would stay away from its initial point for a sustained period. Whereas since the 90s, if there's a shock to inflation, it's transitory, and you go back to the underlying level. And that's consistent with a world in which inflation expectations have been well anchored. And so shocks to inflation tend to be transitory as long as that policy is consistent with that. That is, by the way, Silvana's way of thinking about it, the endogeneity of policy, I think that's very complementary. On the one hand, if inflation expectations are very well anchored, then policy can relatively easily succeed in keeping inflation at target, and vice versa. If policy is committed to keeping inflation near target, then inflation expectations tend to be well anchored. So I think that explains the broad changes in the inflation process, and it probably helps, at least to a first instance, to explain the most recent behavior. Part of the reason why inflation didn't fall so much in the recession was because inflation expectations were well anchored. On the downside, they probably did fall to some extent. We've seen some evidence that inflation expectations fell, which is probably part of the reason that inflation's been slow to come up. Having said that, I think there are a lot of interesting points made today. For example, clearly part of the reason that inflation's been slow to come up is that the Fed underestimated how far the labor market could be pushed, along with what Jared talks about. U-star unemployment, natural rate of unemployment, is probably a good bit lower than the Fed thought a couple years ago, and that gives some scope for further expansion in the labor market. Some of the points that Kristen made about the global factors that kept inflation from falling quite so much after the panic, I think are relevant, and the transmission of that to prices. So there's a bunch of, in any short period, there's going to be a bunch of idiosyncratic and other factors that are relevant. I think over the longer period, I do think the change in the structure of monetary policy is the most important thing, but all these other things obviously are relevant too.
Paul, what sense do you make of all this?
Oh, yeah, it's maybe the most important thing is that we actually basically understand the economy a lot less well than we thought we did. I think that has got, and which has a huge bearing on policy. I actually wanted to say something about Olivier's proposal, because I have thought something along the same lines, and then kind of backed off it, even though the economics seems to be totally right. And here's the point.
You're talking about targeting wages.
Targeting wages. There's one thing, nobody really talked about it here, but one huge success story of sort of conventional monetary analysis over these past 10 years has been the distinction between core and headline inflation. I'm sure Ben remembers this even better than I do, but we remember 2010, 2011 when headline inflation was going up mostly because of oil prices, and the Fed was saying, no, calm down, it's core inflation that we should be looking at, and was totally vindicated in that. But we're now seeing that there's some stuff going on even with the core inflation measure. And, but if we think about conceptually what we mean by core, we mean stuff that is kind of sticky. sticky. And the coriest thing out there, the coriest of the core, is in fact wage inflation. So it makes a lot of sense to say let's target wages. Except I'm trying to imagine the situation of the chair of the Fed saying, we are raising interest rates because wages are rising too fast. I just don't think, I think, you know, it's good economics, but the political economy is just going to be disastrous.
I think saying we are committed to make sure that wages increase no matter what at 3% a year.
Maybe. I think I think it's not just 40% of Finns, but a large proportion of the population as a whole that just doesn't get messages that complicated.
Ben, your body language suggests that you're not ready to endorse the Blanchard rule.
I was just having exactly the same reaction that Paul did, that, you know, I wouldn't want to sit in front of Congress and say we're very concerned that wages are rising too quickly. So that's a concern. I think it's a complicated question. I mean, there's elements of the price process which are independent of labor markets, and I think need to factor into the monetary policy as well. But
it seems that at the same time as we've had a long period of below target inflation in many countries around the world, we've also seen this decline in R star, the so-called natural rate of interest, the interest rate that will prevail when all is calm, which has been pointed out is, we don't know what it is, but there's certainly a widespread consensus that it has fallen a lot. And I'm sort of wondering, it seems to me this is two questions. One is, are these things related? And secondly, this is kind of challenging. How should monetary policy think about a world where inflation, at least for now, seems to be persistently low, and the natural rate of interest seems to have fallen and is also persistently low?
So I have as you might guess, a somewhat facetious answer to the first part, which is, so it looks like U star and R star, if such things exist, which we're not even dead sure about that, but it looks like both of them have fallen. If you ask why has U star gone down, the answer is we really don't know. If you ask why has R star gone down, we really don't know. So the common factor is both of them are caused by we really don't know.
I thought the catch-all answer is always it has something to do with demography.
Well, that was going to be the next thing. If I had to make up a story, I'd say demography. But it's you can make a story along those lines. Although the fact that the wage Phillips curve is holding up better makes it harder to tell the demographic story. If it was just a more experienced older workforce, that should be showing up in the wage Phillips curve, and which is the less dramatic part of the story. But I buy the demography on secular stagnation story. I think that's right. But what I would take from it as just the general policy lesson is, look, it seems quite possible that there's still quite a lot of slack in the advanced world as a whole. We don't know that for sure, but it looks like there is. And at the same time, there is very little monetary space in the world as a whole, which should give us a lot of anxiety. We should be worrying a lot because if we're in this situation now, when nothing really bad has happened lately, we're in big trouble. If sooner or later something really bad will happen. And so, I think the two factors together mean that we should be worrying a lot about what can we do to give us some more space for policy response, which is going to get us, I think, to some of the other questions that you gave us about inflation targeting and fiscal policy.
Can I go back to the R star, U star conundrum? I think it's a bit worse than we don't know.
Great. All right.
Because I think the main explanation for U star is really weaker bargaining power of workers, it seems to me, fundamentally. And that seems to be good news for the other side, for the capital side, the profit side, and the R, the risky R. And so in that light, I think the decrease in R star, which I think is there, is even more of a puzzle.
Great. So Loretta,
can I ask?
Fortunately, you have to make decisions without full information.
You always have to make decisions without full information. I guess I'm going to push back a little bit on the fact that we have all this slack still out there. Because if you talk to firms, in fact, we had a panel yesterday at the Cleveland Fed, they routinely tell us, and this has been going on for several years, about the difficulty of finding workers that they can hire. You push back on them and they say, okay, are you raising wages? They'll say yes. But that's changing now. Okay, now they're basically saying that it's not really worth trying to hire the pool that's still out there, because when they do bring them in, they don't stay on staff more than a month. So I say, well, do you know where they're going? And they have no idea. It's not being bid away for other wages. So what is the response now? The response now is they're going to start automating more. And you've seen that in all these firms. So I think, I would say that we have done a lot in terms of running policy much more accommodative than we would have in the past. Partly that's because we've brought down our estimates at U-Star. So in Jared, if someone were going to say, relative to the old U-Star, we are running the economy very hot, and our policy is much more accommodative than it would be on an old traditional Taylor rule. So in that sense, I think we've taken on board some of the things that you talked about in terms of we have to rethink when we don't see wages going up or we don't see inflation going up, we have to rethink our policy rule, and I think we've done that. But at some point, there are unintended consequences of doing a policy like that. And so you may be ending up affecting long-term employment growth, because if you automate more in these firms, you're not going to have the demand for labor as high. So I'm very sympathetic to wanting to be at maximum employment. That's certainly our goal. I think the policy tool we have in monetary policy isn't really going to affect the overall labor market in the way that you want to. I think the things you pointed out in terms of the things that we talk about when we go out into the district, right? Job programs, getting people the skill sets they need for running those robots that are coming into these plants. All those things are going to have much bigger impact on public welfare in terms of getting people to work. There's a whole other set of issues about how to get people to work, which is another issue. Transportation is an issue. So there's a lot of structural things that have nothing to do with monetary policy that can improve labor market
outcomes. I don't understand the problem. So you run the economy hot. Yeah. Workers, that we pull lots of workers into the labor market. Wages start to rise. Firms then start to automate, which increases the pace of productivity growth. And you're worried that we're going to run out of jobs?
Well, no, I'm worried that there's going to be a whole segment of the population. Right now, they don't have the skills that are in demand. And so what happens to those people? Unless you are training them for the modern jobs, you're in trouble. We've had a shift in our district from manufacturing to other types of jobs. There is a mismatch between the skills that people have that want to enter the labor market and the skills in demand. And unless we're doing something about that, it's going to be very hard, right, to improve, outcomes. And so I think that's one of the things that the Fed Listen, conferences we've been doing around the district, we've heard time and time again. They're not that concerned about us hitting a 2% inflation target. They are much more concerned about, am I going to be able to provide, food on the table for my family? And so I think we have to think a little bit about what tools we use, right, for which problem we're trying to affect. Right.
Ben, can I steer back to the question about the challenging combination of low neutral rates and low inflation? What is the right response of monetary policymakers, and does it matter where your starting point is? Our inflation is getting close to 2%. Japan, it's their inflation expectations are still below 1%. What's the right answer?
Let me start by saying that I think that the decline in R-star is mostly understandable. I think demographics, global savings and investment patterns, technology, all those things that a lot of people have talked about, I think they can explain most of what's going on there. I'm actually more puzzled about the U-star decline than I am about the R-star decline. So I think I understand that, and it's something that's outside of monetary policy, but it's now a constraint on monetary policy. I think I want to do a half empty, half full kind of response to your question, though. There's this correct point that historically the Fed has cut the federal funds rate 5.5 percentage points during recessions, and now we only have, supposedly 3 percentage points of room. Some work I'm doing and thinking about this, I think that if appropriate use of forward guidance, quantitative easing, some of these tools, plus thinking about different frameworks for policy, I think altogether that they add about 3 percentage points in space. And so my sense is that as long as nominal neutral rates are, say, 2.5 to 3, something like that the Fed will be able to do most of what it could do, at any point in history in terms of using traditional policy rules. So I think that, saying that we're now basically out of space, in the United States, that's wrong. It is also, though, true that once, neutral rates get much lower than, say, 2.5 nominal, then you are running into a much more difficult situation. And then we'll talk about alternatives, fiscal policy, and the like. But I think that, asking for 5 and 6 percentage points of space is not needed. I think that these other tools, in fact, are effective, and if appropriately used, can compensate for some of that loss in R-star.
But these other tools are already partly used. Your 3%, some of
Yes,
it has been
yes.
used already, so it's not.
Yeah, well, they
it's
can be
not-
used better and more aggressively, number one. But number two, I'm just talking now about the next recession and what the Fed will be able to do, starting from where it is, if there's a medium-sized recession.
Do you think there's
future.
3 percentage points of unconventional monetary policy left,
Yeah.
Yeah.
unused?
Yes. Yes.
Paul Krugman, are you as sanguine as that?
I'm not sanguine. I mean, I'd hate to Ben knows more about this than anyone, but I've just been a skeptic. I mean, the fact that we're still arguing about the effectiveness of QE after all these years, I think is a persuasive evidence that the evidence ain't that persuasive. And so it seems dubious. And let's also say we shouldn't have too much of a parochial U.S. perspective here. I mean, the other large advanced economy, the Eurozone, how much room do they have for that? And so I think a very large part of the world is already in pretty dire straits here, and we have no idea about the size. Yes, 550 basis points has been the historic cut, but that was way inadequate in the last recession we have. We don't think we're going to have another shock, 2008-style shock coming, but of course we didn't think that one was coming either. So I think that we still have a very fundamental problem of just not. We don't know that we don't have enough policy room under existing rules, but there just seems to be a substantial probability that we don't have enough policy room, and that ought to worry us a lot.
And what about Europe and Japan? They don't have the luxury we have, right?
No, I was saying that they're in a much more difficult situation now, particularly Japan. And this goes back to my initial comments about inflation expectations and being anchored, et cetera. One of the reasons to be aggressive on these policies is if inflation expectations get anchored at a low level, then you're in serious trouble.
Right.
And so the Japanese situation is quite different from the U.S. situation fundamentally because of where inflation expectations are. Europe, inflation expectations are too low, but not nearly as low as in Japan. And so I think there's some reasonable probability that they'll, will eventually emerge from their current situation and achieve a more normal stance. But I don't disagree with Paul that Europe and Japan are much more difficult states than the Federal Reserve, number one. I think that, I'll say honestly, having recently been thinking a lot about the evidence on QE, for example, that your comment about we're still arguing whether it's effective or not, that's kind of a median narrative. If you actually look at the research, that the evidence is actually pretty strong that it is effective.
All right.
Olivier, I thought you were going to propose a higher inflation target, and you completely throw me off my game by talking about now targeting wages. Have you surrendered on the idea that 2% inflation is
Never.
just too low? Okay. Just checking.
No, but there's a timing issue, which is that I think it's still a completely reasonable proposal as a steady state solution. And that should be discussed as such. Now, announcing today 4% has zero credibility. I don't think it would help. So that's probably not the time, but if you invite me in a few years.
Okay.
Can I comment on that? Because
Yes,
we
sure.
have some research coming out of the Cleveland Fed that's pertinent to this. So it's, the argument that you raise the inflation rate to get more space seems very salient. It's hard to argue about it. But if firms are then going to be more flexible in their pricing, and there's evidence that suggests higher steady state inflation means firms change their prices more often, it goes back to my original point, which means that monetary policy will have to act even more aggressively to have the same impact. So you don't get as much space as you might think in terms of when you move within a DSG
I think
model.
you have it wrong, which is, suppose prices adjusted very fast, then in principle, things would be better. There would be less need for monetary policy.
Yeah,
and
but once you got into a downturn, you would have less space. So in order to be able to get 2 percentage point of space, right, you'd have to be more aggressive on your policy actions. So it's the transmission mechanism is affected because prices are changing
But again,
more
the
flexibly.
recession, I mean, according to the models we have, the recession would be less bad because prices would adjust faster.
Yeah,
So
so-
it's ambiguous, I think. We can compromise there, right?
Can I just, by the way, say that I'm going to disagree with Olivier that maybe he's saying this is not the time to talk about it. I agree. The bootstrapping, the just announcement, I probably set this thing back by many decades by saying credibly promised to be irresponsible 20 years ago. There's absolutely zero evidence that works. So it wouldn't. But I think if we're thinking about laying the intellectual groundwork for what happens the next time things go really wrong, it might be a good idea to keep alive the fact that the 2% inflation target, which has a very peculiar history and was based on partly on just happenstance, partly on assumptions that have turned out to be entirely wrong, was not a good idea. And that comes the next global slump, and we suddenly have a fiscally profligate Germany and President Bernie Sanders in the United States, and all this stuff, and we have a chance to have a combined fiscal monetary expansion. That the idea that stopping at 2% inflation is not a good idea would be a good thing to have out there.
Okay. Loretta, let me ask you about another thing that people talk about. Some people basically say, yeah, we don't have much inflation, but it's terrific to enjoy the fruits of a hot labor market, but we are sowing the seeds of the next disaster by not taking into account enough the financial stability risks that we run by running low interest rates for such a long time. Is that something to worry about, or is that just something that people worry about who don't have nothing to worry about something else?
So I think what we've learned over the past, several years is that we do have to take financial stability concerns into account when we're thinking about monetary policy. That's not to say to add it as a third mandate or whatever, but it is something that we have to take into account. And you have to recognize that if you're running, very low interest rates, that you may be creating some financial imbalances that may come back to haunt you in the future. So I think you have to sort of understand that those kind of effects can occur. And in fact, Nellie, when she was at the board, she developed the whole structure for allowing the FOMC to actually examine those kind of imbalances and actually monitor them.
And how much of a worry would you say that is today?
I mean, there are some issues in terms of non-financial debt levels being high, commercial real estate pricing being high, but I think they're at moderate levels that we can handle them. But I think it is something that you have to think about, partly because in theory we'd like to use macroprudential tools to worry about financial imbalances and monetary policy to focus on our dual mandate goals. But in reality, that's a hard thing to do because we don't really have that many macroprudential tools in the U.S. And the Fed recently did a tabletop exercise where we ran 3 scenarios. So the Financial Stability Committee within the Fed and the Conference of Presidents did this. We have a working paper out in the Cleveland Fed website that sort of talks about the results of those, that tabletop. And it really is clear that when you get into a situation where financial instability issues come to play, we don't have many tools that we can actually use to address them.
Ben, there was some discussion earlier today about the importance of communications in setting inflation expectations. And, Michael Weber made the case that you really do have to worry about household and firm inflation expectations, and just influencing market participants and investors is inadequate. And he pointed out, which I think something we all know, it's hard to communicate this stuff to ordinary people, even the ones in the top half of the IQ distribution.
Why are you pointing at me?
No. You're in the top, at least the top decile, Ben. But no, do you think it's important? Do central banks have to worry so much about their ability to adjust consumer inflation expectations, or can you get a long way there by influencing the markets, which definitely are influenced by the Fed?
Well, let me first say that I'm very happy about the desire of the Fed and other central banks to do more outreach and to talk to the broader public. The Fed listens series, for example. These are very important institutions. They need to be accountable. They need to be transparent. They need the public to understand what they're doing. There are limitations to that, obviously, but I think it's really important to try to communicate broadly. From a technical perspective, I think you do get a significant way there as long as the markets understand your goals, and maybe some of the pricing executives, the people who are in charge of the pricing and wage setting. I think that gets you a pretty long way. I mean, the Federal Reserve's FERBUS model actually has two settings. It has a setting called model consistent expectations, where everybody's assumed to know what the Fed's target is and behaves accordingly. And then model consistent asset pricing is the second setting, whereby only the bond market understands what you're doing. And it turns out that you get 2/3 or 3/4 of the way there in the second scenario. So, I'm sure it's the case that a very large fraction of the population does not know what the Federal Reserve is, much less what its rate is targeting. I think the Fed and other central banks would be well served by trying to increase literacy about these things. But I don't think that even some of these policies, we'll be talking, I'm sure, about price level targeting, some of these types of policies that rely to some extent on forward-looking behavior. I think that simulations and other analysis suggest that you get a good bit of benefit, even if only a minority of the population understands, exactly what you're trying to do.
Just to say, on demand, monetary policy works basically through housing and the exchange rate.
Yeah.
And so if you can get to the minds of the people who set mortgage rates and people who set exchange rates, that's all that matters.
I wouldn't go quite that far, but
With respect to inflation, what matters is, I think, the expectations, the inflation expectations of firms to a large extent.
Right.
And it's criminal that we don't have a good survey
Criminal.
of firms. Yes, I mean, that's absolutely needed, because when we look at households, their expectations play a very minor role in the determination of wages. In the determination of wages, it's the firms, it's the HR department. So we should have a survey of HR department inflation expectations. This is a really important variable to know. And as far as I can tell, there is none in the US. And the New Zealand example, which I think was referred to by this morning, is not very convincing. I mean, I'm sure the people in HR department are more careful than the households.
I wonder if, before we turn to the audience, if Paul, Ben, and Olivier could give Loretta some advice. Not about what to do with interest rates, but, although that's always welcome, I'm sure that Loretta needs more opinions on what to do with interest rates. But the Fed is involved in this rethink of its monetary policy framework. It has already ruled out Olivier's raise the inflation target option. But briefly, what is it that you think, given all the things we've talked about today, what's happened with inflation, what we understand, what we don't understand, what is the right thing to do with the framework to put us in a better place than we are today? Do you want to start, Paul?
No. No, I mean, I have to admit I'm a little bit baffled. It feels to me as if the various things that our understanding of the economics, such as it is, suggest all seem to be kind of impossible out of some combination of politics and institutional constraints. So raising the inflation target, it's extremely persuasive, but apparently off the table. Wage targeting is extremely persuasive, but I would say that it's off the table. So I'm not at all sure. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm supposed to be saying something helpful here, but I'm feeling like sometimes when you talk to developing countries and try to go through policy options, and they say, well, that would be impossible. And you take all of the constraints, and there turns out to be no space.
We could be there. Ben?
So the Federal Reserve is talking about the so-called make-up policy approach, the idea being that if you fall short of inflation, your target for a period of time, as you have recently, there would be some compensation for that. And the debate about that has turned on technicalities and would it be credible, et cetera. I think there are relatively simple variants of that that are qualitatively possible. It could be explained qualitatively that would get a lot of the benefit. So for example, the technical variant, I've proposed this thing called temporary price level targeting, whereby if you hit the zero lower bound and you fall short of the target, you compensate for that to some extent. The version of that, which seems to work pretty well, is called temporary price level targeting with a 1-year look back. In other words, you only keep rates at zero until you've established over a year that you can hit the target. And what you could explain that qualitatively is saying that when we're leaving from zero lower bound, we want to be sure that we have established robust, like the European Central Bank talking about robustly converging to the target. We don't want to start our process of normalizing rates until we have clearly established that we can meet the target. That over a year. That would be a fairly simple explanation. It would be one that would have most of the benefit because the bond market would appreciate that the Fed would be very slow at beginning to raise rates from a zero lower bound situation. And it doesn't involve complex price level targeting calculations and things of that sort. So that's just an example. I think that the make-up policy approach can be done within the context of the current inflation target, but simply defining what it means to hit the target. And in particular, that hitting the target just momentarily is not enough, that we want to establish that we are sustainably at the target. And simply doing that would have some of the make-up qualities that these optimal, theoretical approaches have, and would not involve any major change. I don't think it would create any particular political scrutiny or any particular confusion. So that'd be my suggestion.
Olivier?
So I think that we're flirting with a world of secular stagnation to different degrees. Here we're flirting. In Europe, we have married it.
Right?
And so in that world, monetary policy is going to be very constrained. And we see it in Japan, we see it in Europe. I totally support what Ben is pushing, but I suspect it's really second order relative to the size of the task. And so that maybe you're going to be able to predict what I'm going to say. What about fiscal policy? Yeah. It seems to me that fiscal policy in the same context is needed. It's cheap. And
because rates are so low.
And rate. I mean, yes, the cost of debt is very low, and it can be used infinitely better. In the U.S., unfortunately, I have no doubt that our president and our Congress will use it. Probably not right, but they'll use it. But in Europe, clearly the issue is to convince governments to do it. But it seems to me the solution is not to try to do some more twist on money, which I think we have to, but not hope that that's going to be the solution. The solution is to have a more expansionary fiscal policy.
Butter, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I mean, just the way you think about inflation expectations needing to be well anchored to allow monetary policy to, counteract negative shocks. I think for the fiscal policy, same thing. Like if we had fiscal policy on a sustainable path, then you would be able to use it in the way that we'd like to be able to use it as countercyclical policy. I think the same issue. I think just like we need to make sure that we're running monetary policy to keep inflation expectations anchored so that it allows us to use monetary policy more effectively. I think the same thing with the fiscal side. And so we are in a sort of a dilemma here.
We have time for some questions. Again, raise your hand, stand up, tell us who you are, and be as brief as possible. There's a one here. And I'm going to take three, and then we'll see where we go.
So this is for the whole panel.
Tell us who you are.
Grade school. This is for the whole panel. So do you see a future of much more coordinated monetary and fiscal policy? And what would be monetary policy like in that regime? Thank you.
Thank you. Jared Bernstein over here.
Instead of targeting, Jared Bernstein, instead of targeting wage growth, how about targeting labor share? Because there are times when you want unit labor costs to be rising in order to rebalance factor shares that get whacked in a downturn, as we've seen.
Okay, why don't you pass it behind you?
Thanks very much, Matthias Matthijs. I teach political economy at SAIS across the street. My question, I guess, is for the current and former central bankers mainly. I can't think of an decade where central bankers have been so attacked by politicians like Mark Carney, by Brexiteers, our current central banker by the president, Mario Draghi by German politicians. Is this something you actively worry about, that this is going to get worse? Is this something that's going to go away if we get back to more normal times of monetary policy? And is this affecting how people think about the credibility and the need for central bank independence? Thank you.
So let's start with the coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. Is that likely, and what does it look like? Yeah?
I learned everything from Krugman about this, and the Krugman taught me that it only works if inflation expectations go up, right? If the monetary, so as long as the inflation target is credible, then you might as well just do the fiscal policy and have the monetary policy sort of agree to be supportive in some way.
Yeah. So yeah, there would be. I mean, there's this idealized, by the I'll call it the Blanchard 4% inflation target. Although that's me too. But anyway, so we have a coordinated fiscal expansion to get you to that point, which is ratified by monetary. That doesn't seem to be on the table anywhere. And then if we talk about actual coordination that might happen, I actually worry a lot about who's coordinating with whom. So I would be perfectly happy with Mario Draghi getting to set German fiscal policy. I'm not very happy with the German government getting to set ECB policy.
Olivier?
Yeah, I think that there are two dimensions of coordination. There is within a country fiscal and money. I think that can be done in very simple coordination. I mean, you do something, you tell a fiscal authority you do something, and as a central bank, I'll react to it and make sure that I undo the effect on output if it's negative. I don't think it implies, more than just that. Clinton Greenspan is an example of that. I think can be done. Coordination across fiscal policies, across countries. That's a much more difficult issue in the Eurozone. And there again, I think that, if the Eurozone goes through a recession, the uncoordinated fiscal response will be too weak, because when Belgium expands, it doesn't get much of a reward. So there I think there is a need for coordination. Whether it happens or not, it should. It probably will not, would be my answer.
Loretta, when the question was asked about central bankers being attacked, which is of course true, I had this image that Paul Volcker would storm into the room and say, like, you guys don't know what being attacked is. But
Exactly.
I think there is an attack on central banks around the world, and of course on other institutions as well. And I think he was wondering, how do you cope with that as a central banker who doesn't seem like an evil person, at least from my conversations with you?
Thanks. I'll take that. Look, I feel like I'm privileged to work at the Federal Reserve. I feel that it's a very honorable institution. I've met and worked with people like Ben, and I can just tell you everyone is sort of focused on making sure that our policy is the best policy we can to hit our goals. There are going to be challenges thrown in your face. One of them may be the criticisms we're getting in this environment. But it's part of the job that you just have to kind of stick to the knitting and make sure that you're doing your policy the best you can. And there is no simple answer on policy. That's why you see sort of the discussions that we're having in terms of what's the way to go about doing it, what's the right policy. So you have to deal with that. I do have concern that we get this question all the time, and if you've been at FOMC meetings, like these considerations never enter the room in terms of our policy setting. But the fact that we're getting asked these questions do make you have to be taken into account that there are people out there who may not know that, right? These considerations are not affecting our policy, and so I do have concerns about that. So.
And on Jared's question about targeting labor share instead of...
I think it's a very different animal. I was targeting nominal wage growth, not real wage growth. Labor share is much more real variable, so I would not touch it.
I'm reminded of one of Bernanke's great lines in the transcripts is when the Bureau of Economic Analysis revises GDP growth for a number of years. Bernanke says, well, if they can revise GDP retroactively, can we do the same thing with interest rates? I'll take two more. Bert Ely in the back, and then this gentleman over here, and then we'll have to call it a day.
Bert Ely, a banking consultant. There was a reference to fiscal policy, to coordination with monetary policy. How realistic is that in the United States today, given the very substantial deficits that we're running and a rapidly rising ratio of federal debt to GDP? Another way to put it is fiscal policy as a response to a downturn really off the table, given how significant the federal deficit is during a full employment economy?
Thanks. And there's one gentleman there. Thank you.
Alan Detmeister, UBS. President Mester, you mentioned an inflation band. So how wide would that band have to be? Standard deviation of core PCE inflation is roughly 0.4 a year. Katya showed in her charts that core PCE over the last 20 years has been around 1.7. We're currently running 1.8. Is monetary policy precise enough to be able to push up inflation a 0.25 percentage point?
Okay, why don't you take that one, and then we'll let.
I mean, I just think as a communication device, we know inflation is going to vary for various reasons. I think as a communication device, having a band makes sense. It also allows you to have some scope to run inflation a bit higher in the band during good times, and then when you go lower, go into sort of getting closer to the zero lower bound, inflation will be below the 2%. So it gives you more scope.
So like what,
and more
1
flexibility.
percentage point?
It could be, or, I mean, that's not a bad target. I mean, just thinking about sort of how you'd want to run sort of higher in normal times and maybe less high in more downturns.
Yeah, I somehow, this relevant to the coordination, I somehow forgot to mention one place where you really have had coordinated fiscal and monetary policy is Japan. Abe and Kuroda, basically. And in some respects, the outcome has been disappointing. But one thing that has certainly not been a problem is people losing confidence in the ability of the Japanese government to repay its debts. And Japan is far deeper in debt and has far worse long-term demographics than the United States. So the notion that the United States is anywhere close to, Olivia has documented this a lot, the idea that we're anywhere close to the limits of fiscal policy just seems to be utterly at odds with all the evidence.
You agree with that?
Yeah, that's no justification for doing something crazy. But
good to know. All right, this could go on for a long time, and I really want to thank all the presenters, and because we had a pretty good group of people, and I want to thank my colleagues who helped organize this, and thank all of you for the good questions. If you could do me one more favor on your way out, if there's papers or coffee cups at the back of your room, there's a trash can in that corner. We'd appreciate that. And please join me in thanking everyone.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.